My name is Peter Schiavone, Director of Veteran Services for the town of Braintree, and this is Veterans Corner. A little bit of good news from the VA this week. Any veterans who are currently enrolled in the VA healthcare system and have hearing problems, the VA will supply you with hearing aids. But you have to be enrolled in the VA healthcare system. In the past, you had to be a disabled veteran with your hearing loss service-connected. This is new now, and this will save veterans a lot of money. Hearing aids are expensive. But again, you have to be enrolled in the VA healthcare system. If you have any questions, call me at my office. My direct line is 781-794-8217, and I'll be glad to give you some more information on that matter. Today we have with us Tom Grace, our resident Medal of Honor historian. We're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Hudner's Medal of Honor action in the Korean War. And Tom, you want to talk a little bit about that, what we're going to discuss today? The second part, we've showed you the first part, and we're going to talk a little bit about his actual action receiving the Medal of Honor and what he actually did in Korea.
Yeah, Mr. Hudner, we got so much tape that we were fortunate enough to have two parts to this. First part, he spoke about his naval career, which was a very distinguished naval career. He talked about his flight school and the particular type of aircraft that he flew. And this next part goes into his actual Medal of Honor action. His Medal of Honor action, he was flying a Corsair, very difficult aircraft. They talked about to land on an aircraft carrier, much less crash land on the side of a mountain, which is what he did to save, or to try to save, a fellow naval aviator, a gentleman by the name of Ensign Jesse Brown, who was the first black naval aviator. And it's really quite a story, and we'll let him tell the story.
Okay,
it goes into the story right now.
Of Tom Hudner being interviewed by Tom Grace.
Your Medal of Honor action occurred on a cold December day.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please describe Ensign Brown?
Well, Ensign Jesse Brown was from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. His father was a sharecropper. Jesse went to the Hattiesburg public schools, and he was a very good student and a good athlete. And as an indication of the type of student he was the valedictorian of his class. And based on his academic performance and his athletic ability, he got a scholarship to Ohio State University. And even before he went to Ohio State, this was after World War II was all over, he wanted to fly airplanes. He was encouraged to go into the Navy when he got to Ohio State, and he's working his way through there, working in Pullman cars and, as I understand, loading box cars and stuff like that, and doing his studying all along. But he was encouraged by a naval officer to put in for the Navy's flight program, which surprised Jesse quite a bit because, to his knowledge, no blacks had ever gone through naval aviation. Well, make a long story short, he did get through, suffered all sorts of indignities, because flight training was all down south, Pensacola and Corpus Christi, and there was a very definite bias or even bigotry towards any black, regardless of what his status was, even in uniform. So when he got his wings in 1948, the Navy Department, to keep him from the same type of environment that he lived in, both before getting in the Navy and even after getting in the Navy, assigned him to a Naval Air Station at Quonset Point, where they felt that there would be a minimum of prejudice. But he ran into it, a lot of it there. and fortunately made some friends who did everything they could to make life easy for him. And he was accepted into the squadron that I was eventually assigned to, I think almost with open arms. He was very well received. Considered to be a very capable officer, except for his color and the uniqueness of his being in the squadron. They didn't pay much more attention to him than anybody else. But he was well liked. He was married. He got married before he got his wings because, although it was illegal, he needed comfort and solace while going through in order to maintain his sanity. So he and his wife got married, and had he been found out before he got his wings, he'd have been thrown out of the program. So when they got to Quonset Point, they had a very difficult time finding a place to live. And finally did find some place through the assistance of a black petty officer whom Jesse befriended. And this petty officer and his wife were very helpful to both of them to settle into a community which still had big barriers against the blacks. So Jesse, as far as, you know, once you get over the idea that you're with a very unusual guy, life in the squadron with him was just as it would be with anybody else. We all got our flying assignments. There's no favoritism in that squadron, nor is there in any squadrons that I've ever been in or heard of. Jesse had to do the dirty stuff just as everybody else did, and he got the good things when it was time for him to get them also. So it was never any concern on any particular flight that Jesse was going to be flying that. He was, I will say, a good pilot. And he's still too young to be recognized, if ever it was, that he was going to be an outstanding guy, and he's going to be a super ace or anything like that. He did what everybody else did. He had his good flights, and he had those that he wished he'd been able to fly over again. So.
That fateful day, what took place that was it a morning flight?
No, we took off, as I remember, about 1:30 in the afternoon.
Okay.
It would have been, this was on December 12th. And incidentally, the climate there in Korea is pretty much the same as it is in the Northeast. More extreme perhaps, but basically the same. The summers, such as we have here today, could be pretty darn hot, and the winters can be pretty cold, but exacerbated up in the northern part of the country with those mountains and the winds that come down from up in Asia, Siberia. And we took off, as I remember, it was 1:30. It was going to be a 3-hour flight. And we were assigned, there were 6 of us in our squadron, 6 Corsairs, assigned on one of those armed reconnaissance missions where we were going to be flying around roughly 20 miles or so of some designated point. And during this time, it was 4 or 5 days after the Chinese had suddenly attacked, almost completely without warning. It attacked the Marines and soldiers who were up in the vicinity and north of the Chosin Reservoir. And the northern tip of the Chosin Reservoir is only about 75 miles from Manchuria. So even though we weren't flying in direct support of the troops on this particular day, we were flying not too far away from them, but we were not flying over them so that we could see the troops. about halfway through the flight, where we had probably dropped some ordnance, and I can't remember whether we had fired at anybody or dropped bombs or had done anything up to this time. Jesse called out that he was losing power and he wasn't able to stay airborne. Well, we're up in the mountains at that time, and the terrain was covered by a lot of this, we call it scrub pine. There was really no place to land, except that he or one of the other fellows in the flight happened to see there was a clearing which would be within gliding distance of where Jesse was, and he was able to get his airplane over there and did land with no power at all, but he hit the ground with such force that it bent the aircraft at the cockpit. Probably at about 30, I'm guessing about 30 degrees. And his canopy, which had been open when he hit the ground, it slammed shut. And, you know, we're practically speechless. There was our friend, it just, we thought, died right there in front of us. But after this happened, our flight leader, who was the squadron's executive officer, climbed up to high altitude so he could get better radio reception and called for a rescue helicopter, because we knew that the Marines had been flying some helicopters in support of their troops on the ground. And while he was gone, or off the radio, Jesse opened the canopy of his airplane and waved at us, but still sat in the cockpit. He waved at us to let us know that he was alive, and yet he didn't get out. Seemingly made no effort to do so, but when we noticed him, he'd taken his helmet off, and so we couldn't talk to him on the radio if it happened to be working. And there was smoke coming out from under the cowling of the airplane. It wasn't intense, but there was smoke coming out indicating a fire or something very hot. Our flight leader, shortly after this, came back on the radio and said he had gotten acknowledgement from the Marines for a request for a helicopter, and one was on the way, but it'd be a while before it could get there. And so I thought, by the time he could possibly get here, that smoke could burst out into flame, and if it were a bad fire, that could kill Jesse in itself. So I made the decision that since it seemed all Jesse needed was a tug to get him out of the cockpit, then I'd crash land my airplane close to his and pull him out of the cockpit and just wait for the helicopter. And that's what I did. I landed about 100 yards away from his airplane. There was about 18 to 20 inches of snow on the ground. It was drifted up in that terrain, but I'm saying roughly 1.5 to 2 feet deep. You could see the reason he didn't get out of the aircraft is that when the fuselage buckled the way that it did, it had caught his right leg in the airplane, so he couldn't move it. And because of the snow on the ground, it was packed on the soles of my boots so that I couldn't get any footing at all when I climbed up onto his airplane. I'd had to hold on with one hand, and reaching in the cockpit with the other hand, I could see that I just couldn't do anything at all. So I went back to my airplane and turned on the battery, which you're not supposed to do, but turned the battery on so they'd get the radio going, and was able to establish radio communications with my flight leader and asked assessed him with the situation a little bit, and then asked that he bring a fire extinguisher and an axe, knowing nothing else to ask for. And then went back with Jesse, talked to him a little bit, but there wasn't an awful lot we could talk about. But he was very, very calm. He has to have been badly injured when you think about hitting the ground as hard as he did to buckle the airplane the way it was. How he survived, I don't know. But I shoveled snow with my hands, just shoveled it up under the cowling, hoping that would, I could get enough in there to have some effect on that smoke, but it didn't. And then when the helicopter pilot arrived with an axe and a fire extinguisher, we squirted the fire extinguisher up into the cowling, and that didn't last more than a few moments, and it didn't seem to help at all. But eventually that smoke did abate and it stopped. And what its cause was, I don't know. I think in the crash that either some oil, hydraulic fluid, or something spilled, and it didn't burst into flame, but a smoke from hitting something really hot in the engine, and it was finally burned off by itself.
He was pretty coherent when you first
Yes,
went over to him?
when I first went to him, he made a comment to the effect, we've got to figure out a way to get out of here. No panic. He spoke deliberately, and if he hadn't been in the condition he was in, you'd think he was just lying in a bunk, saying we've got to do something about this. He was not pleading in any way. He had no suggestions as to what to do. After I looked at the situation, I, what else can you do? Let's hope that another pilot, inform the helicopter pilot, between the two of us, we may be able to do something. But he was hindered in the same way I was, with not being able to get any footing on the airplane at all. It was having to reach up, it was over our heads, reach up, except when we climbed up onto the plane, as I said, we had to hold on with one hand. And there's not much you can do with only one hand in a situation like that.
How long after he crashed, how long before you made the decision to crash on your plane? How long were you flying around him in a circle?
Probably 5 or 10 minutes.
Did you?
I didn't, incidentally, I emphasized that I knew what reality was, and I wasn't about to go if we knew that, if we didn't know that helicopter was coming. Because there was no way that, even if I were alone, but even if I were to get Jesse out of that airplane, we just couldn't have survived. So I put 100 faith on that helicopter once I heard he was coming.
Right. Was that something that you needed permission to do? Did you radio that you were going to do it, or did you just make a decision?
Yeah, I probably should have, but the situation was clear enough to me, and if I'd made the decision that I was going to go in, I didn't want to pass it off onto somebody else to have to say, yes, go in, and then suffer the consequences of giving me permission, or to say no, and then I couldn't go, so I just announced that I was going in, and the squadron, I don't know if anybody ever said anything to the squadron commander about it, but I think I think, because I was told so, but I don't remember being told that none of us, if something like this happened, that none of us was going to try anything so foolish as to wreck his airplane and go in. All I could see was saving Jesse's life. And if I was lucky, we could do it. My big question now is, since I'd gone to that trouble, since the helicopter pilot exposed himself, what is in the grand design that kept us from doing so? I've never questioned. I have a question that if he hadn't been pinned in that way, if it was just a matter of not being able to get around, we could have twisted his leg around. The helicopter was there to save us both.
Now, brings us back a bit to earlier in the conversation, when we talked about how difficult the Corsair was to land on a carrier. It must have been, did you have a hard time trying to actually decipher, because of the snow on the ground, where the ground was? Depth
Well, I
perception?
didn't know what was under it. But it was frozen solid.
I mean, forgive me for asking these questions, but it's just like you say, it's probably one of the, I hate to use the word, one of the most heroic things I've ever heard of, and but there are some technical aspects to it as well, and it really is beyond my comprehension that anyone would actually attempt to do this for another human being, but actually the skill level that you must have had as a naval aviator, I don't think can be ignored either, because you actually were able to get your aircraft, and I've actually seen a picture of both aircraft on the ground within 100 yards of his. It just, and then to power up your aircraft again, I mean, that's, you can start fires that way.
No, I didn't know that. I didn't power up my plane again. I knew that when I touched down, it was gonzo. But in our training as carrier aviators, we had to fly so precisely that I could pretty well set it down almost exactly where I wanted to.
And you kept the wheels up.
Wheels up, yes. The side of the mountain was about a 20-degree upgrade. And what had been my idea was to get downwind, and the wind was pretty much on our nose, which was favorable. What I intended to do was get down fairly low and then fly up the slope and gradually fly into the ground. But what I wasn't making any allowance for is what was probably mushing, what they call mushing. This means that you're not just flying straight through the air, you're flying through the air like that. And so I hit with a strong vertical component. It was a lot harder than I had imagined, and I was very lucky because it hurt my back, but it took a while before I was aware of it, and it didn't hinder my movements once I got on the ground, but it was later on it began to stiffen up.
And the weather was very cold that day.
Yeah, it was cold. I don't remember that there were any obstructions to visibility, but that night, when we had to leave Jesse, when the helicopter pilot pulled me aside and said that he wasn't instrumented, his aircraft didn't have the instruments to be able to fly around in terrain like that after dark. That was bad enough during the day. So we had to go while there's still plenty of daylight. And he actually gave me the choice of staying with Jesse or going with him. Well, Jesse was fading fast. I feel that one of the reasons that he wasn't in visible agony was that he was in a state of shock. And his hands, he'd taken his gloves off before I even got to the airplane. His hands were frozen solid. We didn't wear clothes in flying. We wore clothes that would keep us warm enough in the cockpit, but we didn't wear Arctic type of things. It was too cumbersome, and we needed some mobility in the cockpit. So that, but what we did have on is what they call exposure suits, and these were rubberized suits that we climbed into, like the old Dr. Denton's baby winter pajamas. But that doesn't keep you warm. That's to protect you from water immersion in case you flew in and crashed at sea. And I have to say, in all candor, I didn't know whether Jesse was dead at the moment we left him. But he was responding to some of my comments and didn't respond to others. And I think it's because he was unconscious some of this time, or he must have been extremely tired. And so I told him that we had to get some other equipment. We couldn't do anything for him, and we'd be back as soon as we could. Well, I knew that was very unlikely, but what hope there was for him, I don't know. But we had to leave him. But before we had left, when I was working with him, he said, if anything ever happens to me, he wanted me to tell his wife how much he loved her. And he did. He loved his wife very much. So the helicopter pilot, whose name was Charlie Ward, a Marine First Lieutenant, took me down to the foot of the Chosin Reservoir to a place called Hagaruri, which is a Marine base camp, and through which all of these troops, the Marines and the soldiers, were dragging across. They come across the frozen reservoir, and they're dog-tired. They've been beaten up. They've been, chased for a couple of days by this time by the enemy. They didn't know if they're going to survive, and it took almost roughly 15 minutes to get from the site of the wreck, get to Hagaruri. And they had nothing. That axe and the fire extinguisher, if that didn't work, they had nothing whatsoever. And they're more concerned about helping these troops bed down for the night and give them something to eat so they could get up and continue their withdrawal the next day. Well, Charlie and I stayed on the ground for about 15 minutes while he got instructions from his superiors, and then the two of us flew down to another base camp on the same mountain road through which everybody would go, about 10 to 12 miles farther on to the south. And Charlie and I spent the night there. We couldn't fly any farther because it was getting dark now. So we spent the night there in they call a pyramid tent with a bunch of other Marines, designed for 4 people, and there were 10 of us in that tent. Spent the night there, and then the next day we flew that helicopter down to a Marine air station called Yanpo. It spent two days there until an aircraft came in from the carrier to take me back out to the ship. But the weather was too bad, so that for the next couple of days there was no flying at all. And that's why it wasn't until the 7th of December that a plane came in from the ship, because up to that time the weather was too bad. So the weather was really bad news for our troops, because they couldn't get air cover, and they had to depend upon air cover to survive because of how vastly outnumbered they were. So that withdrawal continued all the way down to a seaport called Hudner, and they evacuated the soldiers as soon as they could load those ships up. And the last person was evacuated on Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, and they evacuated over 100,000 United Nations forces, most of whom were Americans, and over 90,000 North Koreans who were trying to get away from the other North Koreans. And those ships went down to Busan, which is the southern end of Korea, and a lot of them went over to Japan. And then after a couple of weeks, our forces regrouped. They gave very serious consideration to getting out of Korea completely. And fortunately, the decision was made with a lot of clenching of teeth, I know, that we weren't going to be driven off the peninsula. So we brought troops back and slowly forced the North Koreans and the Chinese back up again. And then the war lasted for another 2.5 years after that, stabilized somewhat, and now 53 years later, we're in the same dilemma as we were at that time, but we don't know what this new leader, Kim Jong-il, is going to do.
Very radical,
Yeah.
this guy, yeah. Like we spoke about earlier, I don't think he doesn't seem to care how many people
Yeah.
he kills. Mr. Hudner, how soon after you get back to the ship did you realize that you had been nominated for the Medal of Honor for that action?
Well, I happened to see a week or two later a piece of paper which was inadvertently left out that had recommended for CMO. I didn't even know what they were talking about. And nothing was said. The first word I got about it was after our squadron got back to Quonset Point. It was early part of March, I think, that I got a phone call from somebody in the White House that I'd be presented on the 13th of April in 1951.
Wow.
And it happened to be the first medal that was presented for the Korean War. There are other actions that took place for which people got the medal after I did, but I happened to be the first Korean War person who was presented with the medal.
The day you were presented, Ensign Brown's widow was there as well?
Yes, she was. Just think, this is only 4 months after her husband died. She was there as a guest of the Navy Department, and this was a day of, you might say, jubilation for my family and me. I have 3 brothers and a sister, and they're all there, and my parents, of course, and aunts and uncles from both my home in Fall River and my mother's home in Pennsylvania. And she was there all alone, escorted by a Navy lieutenant and a Navy enlisted woman. And she was just the epitome of grace. She was an admirable woman at that time, and that's the way she's been all her life. She's retired now. She must be about 75, living still in Hattiesburg, where she grew up, where Jesse was born and grew up. And now she has a couple of great-grandchildren, and she actually had a grandson and a granddaughter, and then they both have children.
Great, so at least it turned out that she
Oh yes.
was able
And I
to.
think she's been treated very well. When I say treated very well, she's respected by the whole community in Hattiesburg. None of the prejudice that they grew up with. She was a school teacher, and after she finished a career as teaching, she was on the school board for a number of years, and I think she's quite content. She was remarried about 10 or 15 years after this, and her husband was retired Air Force Master Sergeant, and he died about, I think about 10 years after they were married.
Poor thing. Now the United States Navy commissioned a ship in honor of Ensign
Yeah.
Brown.
Mm-hmm. USS Jesse Brown, the DE 1098, I think was the number. And she was a class of ship that was decommissioned probably about 6 or 8 years ago, and she was sold to the Egyptian Navy.
Uh-huh.
Got renamed, of course, as they do all those ships. And I don't know how the ship is doing, but that ship did have a good reputation. In the Navy, after a while, ships begin to get reputations of being a good ship or a bad ship. But she had a good reputation, and I never ran into any of her crew, officer or enlisted, who wasn't very proud to have been aboard Jesse Brown. The big picture of him in the wardroom of the ship, I don't think it's the best picture. I never liked, Jesse was a better looking man than one or two publicity photos from which they've made any number of likenesses. But nevertheless, they're very, very proud of him. He'd have, I don't know what he'd have done later in life, but I think he wanted to get into engineering and be either an engineer or an architect. But we'll never know.
No, unfortunately, no one ever said life was fair. After Korea, you went on to a long and distinguished career in the Navy.
I enjoyed the Navy very much. I had some pretty good assignments. But when I got out of the Navy, I was ready to get out. I got out in 1973, and I wanted to get out while I was still young enough to be able to do something in civilian life. And I haven't done anything significant in civilian life, but the last thing that I did do was I was Commissioner of Veteran Services for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I got a lot of satisfaction out of that job. And it kept me in contact with a lot of veterans I never would have otherwise. Got to know a lot of people in the administration and in the legislature. And can look back with some things that we did, which I think were good for the veterans. And I think the state can be very proud of the veterans population we have. And the state through the years has been extremely supportive of the veterans, and we have one of the best veteran support systems in the whole country, without question.
And so we should. I mean, the veterans are why we're able to live free. We're able to do what we want to do because the veterans allow us that.
Yeah.
And so many of them, I mean, we're up here and really the cradle of liberty is where you live. That's where it all started.
Yeah.
Now, before you left the Navy, you were flying, did you fly jets as well, right up
Oh,
until
yeah.
you left?
When I left that first squadron I was in, when I left that squadron, I went to what they call a carrier division staff, which was based on different aircraft carriers. And our primary position there was not to fly. We did get flying in, but it was a staff job. And then when I left that to go to my next assignment, I went to a jet training program. And this was during a period of great transition from conventional type aircraft to jets. Now they don't have such a transitional program because everybody's obviously trained from the first time they fly. So my last flying in high performance jets was back in it was about 1968. My last tours with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and excuse me, that didn't call for any flying, but we did do some flying for proficiency, so which is about 8 hours a month. And then shortly after that, they changed that whole system so that if your days of flying in an operational capacity are over, you just don't fly anymore. I was right. That was just about that whole change of policy took place about the time I got out of the Navy.
Well,
Well, that was quite an interview, Tom. Good job. What I got out of it was his loyalty to his comrade, to his.
it's amazing, isn't it?
To his fellow pilot, landing his aircraft at the risk of his own life is just remarkable, and that's what Medal of Honor recipients are. They're so loyal to their fellow troops, and they save lives. They try to save lives, and that's what he did, and it's very commendable. And I know Tom Hudner. He was Commissioner of Veterans Services while I was a Veterans Agent. I met him a number of times. An outstanding gentleman, and I'm sure you get the same feeling I got about the loyalty. It's just you can see it in his voice and how he spoke.
Well, I mean, he just was so nonchalant and so modest about speaking of his Medal of Honor action, and I just can't emphasize enough. And when you think about what he actually did that day, it just was an amazing. It's an amazing story. It was a completely, brave, heroic, and
Well, like you said,
selfless act.
the technical aspect of it, landing a plane on the side of a mountain.
Yeah, it's just,
I mean, you can't, I
You
couldn't
can't
land.
practice.
How can you land a plane on a runway?
right.
To do it on the side of a mountain
Right.
in tough conditions it was just a remarkable story, and I thank you for going and visiting Tom Hudner and bringing that story back to the people of Braintree so they can have a better understanding about the sacrifices that some veterans have made. And we'll have more interviews in the future, I'm sure. I know you're probably going to be traveling around interviewing some other Medal of Honor recipients, and I look forward to some in the future. So that concludes our show for today, and I want you to always remember that freedom is not free.